Marshall, and I am the Director of FinScan Advisory Services. Today, we're going to discuss two foundational components of customer identification processes, namely ID validation and verification. Each are important, both are necessary to have an effective customer identification program. And from what I'm seeing with clients across different industries, as regulations tighten and financial crimes become more sophisticated, compliance companies need to adopt more sophisticated customer identification and KYC processes to remain compliant and protect against risk. This also comes with challenges when organizations still need to ensure they are providing seamless and secure customer experience. So today we'll be covering the following topics. First, the compliance requirements. Most regulatory regimes, particularly those where the country is a member of FATF, have compliance requirements for customer identification. We'll discuss the concept of reasonable belief, whereby the regulated entity must form a reasonable belief it knows the true identity of the customer. We'll talk about what that path to a true identity is, namely how do we navigate that path. We'll talk about validation and verification, what each of these are. We'll talk about the risks encountered in identity validation and verification, and risk mitigation, whereby we can mitigate those risks that we encounter. And then we'll talk about the ID validation and verification process and what a typical process looks like. Compliance requirements regarding customer identification, validation, and verification are integral parts of the compliance framework in most countries, and as mentioned, particularly those where the countries are members of FATF. FATF Recommendation 10 states in part, the CDD measures to be taken are as follows: identifying the customer and verifying that customer's identity using reliable independent source documents, data, or information. Further, the recommendation states, financial institutions should be required to verify the identity of the customer and beneficial owner before onboarding or risk establishing a business relationship or conducting a transaction without having proper identification of that customer. Customers may permit financial institutions to complete the verification process as soon as reasonably practicable following the establishment of the relationship, where the money laundering and terrorist financing risks are effectively managed and where it's essential to not interrupt the normal conduct of business. Where the financial institution is unable to comply with the applicable requirements under the recommendation, it should be required not to open the account, commence business relations, or perform the transaction. It should also potentially be required to terminate the business relationship and consider making the suspicious transaction report in relation to the customer. These requirements should apply to all new customers, although financial institutions should also apply this recommendation to existing customers on the basis of materiality and risk, and should conduct due diligence on such existing relationships at appropriate times. Following FATF, the EU, through various AML directives, requires the identification and verification of customers as part of the customer due diligence procedures. The UK, through the money laundering, terrorist financing, and transfer of funds regulations from 2017, requires customer identification and verification as part of the CDD process. In the US, the USA Patriot Act, Section 326, requires the implementation of a customer identification program. It calls for the collection of certain information to identify and verify the customer. The CIP needs to be part of the internal control system called for as part of the BSA program requirements for covered entities. In virtually all cases, the customer identification and verification requirements extend to the UBOs for an organization. As with all things, risk cannot be reduced to zero. FATF Recommendation 10 speaks to identifying and verifying customers using reliable independent source documents, data, or information. In the US, reasonable belief is built into the CIP regulations. In the EU, customer identification and verification should incorporate the use of reliable and independent sources. The UK regulations also incorporate the notion of reasonable belief. While FATF and the EU do not specifically use the phrase reasonable belief, they do speak to using reliable independent sources, and I would argue this brings the concept of reasonable belief into play within those regimes. So what is reasonable belief? Because we know that today fraud is everywhere, the ability to demonstrate reasonable belief may be difficult. Cross-checking against multiple sources to support a formulation of reasonable belief may be necessary. Inconsistencies in information across those multiple sources would also be red flags. This also brings in the notion of checking reliable independent external sources and internal sources of information to identify inconsistencies or red flags. So what is the path to true identity, to forming that reasonable belief that you know the true identity of the customer? Well, it begins with the collection of the information, including the documents, ID numbers, etc. Validation is next. Is the document that contains the relevant information valid? That is, was it issued by an authority indicated, such as the State Department of Motor Vehicle Department? Is it a valid passport, etc.? Then comes verification, for example, matching the customer name against the number provided, the driver's license number, the social security number, or the government ID number. And even with all of this, it may be necessary to validate and verify against multiple sources when available to form that reasonable belief of the true identity of the customer. Let's spend a moment drilling into validation and verification. What are each of these? In the case of validation, we're establishing that the data element provided by the customer exists. That is, does the phone number exist? The driver's license exist? The company exist? We then looking to establish that the document meets the requirements. Driver's licenses have required markings per the state. Does the driver's license number exist in the DMV database? In the case of verification, establishing the true identity of the customer by linking customer data provided to customer information that one may already have. That comparison of information to internal and external sources as well. In short, validation is determining the data element exists, while verification is determining a linkage between the data element and the customer. How is this accomplished? In the case of validation, one is looking to answer the question, is the document or data provided authentic? Is the driver's license real? Is it issued by the correct state? Is the passport issued by the indicated country? Is the corporate registration document one issued by the governing authority? In the case of verification, is the information provided by the customer consistent with the document provided? Is the information provided by the customer consistent with a relevant independent source, that is the Motor Vehicle Department or a credit bureau, for example? Is the information provided by the customer consistent across the various data elements, such as name, address, date of birth, and government ID? In the context of AML processes, this entails collecting information provided by the customer, validating that against internal and external databases, verifying that verifying that data against reliable independent sources, typically external sources of data. And there are situations where it may make sense to match the data provided by a customer to data already in your possession. This may provide red flags. For example, situations where a different name is associated with the same address, a different ID number for the same type of ID is associated with the same name, or vice versa. That is, there's a difference between the name and the ID number. And when looking at validation and verification, what are some of the risks associated with each? Regarding validation, the risks are generally with respect to data. Is it accurate and authentic? Was it obtained through a data breach and therefore used to create a synthetic identity or assume the identity of a customer? Or in the case of identity document fraud, knowingly and without lawful authority producing an identification document, authentication feature, or false identification document, among other things. In the case of verification, the risks include inconsistencies between information provided and the ID itself, not being able to form a reasonable belief, the customer is not the true customer, for example, they're a straw man, the customer is a synthetic customer or has an assumed identity. The customer could also be a deep fake, whereby a document that has been fabricated or manipulated through the use of AI to deceive ID verification systems. How are these risks mitigated? Well, in the case of validation, it begins with data quality. Is the data collected from a prospective customer complete, accurate, timely, etc.? This is addressed through a robust data governance framework that includes data quality, data privacy, and data security components. Once the data is of high quality, you can seek confirmation of the data or document with relevant, reliable, independent sources, such as the DMV or other government agencies. It's important to look across multiple sources in order to truly have a process of forming a reasonable belief that you know the customer based upon the data collected from them. When it comes to the risks associated with verification, a strong program to compare the customer information collected with the customer ID to identify any discrepancy is essential. These discrepancies should be resolved with the customer if possible. The elements of the ID should be confirmed with reliable, independent third-party sources such as credit bureaus. It's also important to look at data you've already collected and to have a robust matching and linking process to check for consistency across data elements. Identity theft red flags include data elements collected from a prospective customer that either individually or collectively are inconsistent with data you previously have collected on that customer. There could be instances where name, address, date of birth, and government ID number collected from a prospective customer have already been used and are not consistent with what you already have. For example, name, address, date of birth, and government ID number collected can be matched and linked to an existing customer, with one data element being different, for example, the date of birth. Is it significantly different? This would be a red flag and warrant possible investigation of possible identity theft. In fact, in the US, the Fair and Accurate Credit Transaction Act requires covered entities to have an identity theft prevention program, which includes having having reasonable policies and procedures. This includes comparing the information in the consumer report with information the user maintains in its own records, such as applications, changes of address, notifications, and other customer account information. Also, looking at addresses closely. Is the address a valid address? If it's supposed to be a residential address, is there a company or multiple companies at the same address? Are there multiple names associated with the same address? And those names do not appear to be reasonably related. For example, different members of the same household. These are all examples of risk mitigants for customer identity verification. When it comes to the processes involved in ID validation and verification, most regulatory regimes follow the collection, validation, verification processes. Data is collected along with ID documents. Data is then validated and verified against relevant external sources, and that data is then passed to the KYC database from where the matching and linking process happens. Any discrepancies are investigated, and then there's maintenance of the validation and verification process, and the results are documented as necessary under the regulations. So to summarize, customer identification is a regulatory requirement and includes the requirement to validate and verify a customer's identity. Tools and processes are necessary to establish a reasonable belief. It's essential to understand the risks of not properly identifying a customer and the risks associated with the validation and verification processes. And certainly ID validation and verification are essential elements to an effective AML program. So thank you for your time today. If you have any questions or would like more information, please email us at finscan@innovativesystems.com. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.